Okay, welcome back again. I think we'll try to finish up this chapter on attention with this, I think now third video for the content. So this is where we left off. We've been talking a lot about different kinds of situations where attentional tasks will vary in terms of their difficulty. And we're trying to understand cases where performance breaks down when attentional tasks become more difficult. And another way to think about difficulty here is to try to think about attention as a filter. This is an idea I think brought up in the first chapter when talking about some of the historical influences on cognitive psychology. Broadbent had applied the concept of an electronic filter to attention, right? With the idea that attention works to keep a kind of unwanted information out of the mind, right? So in these situations, we're trying to filter something. But the next question here, so we're filtering distractions, right? We're filtering noise. We're filtering things we're not interested in. But the bigger question really then is where is this filter? And I don't mean where physically like in the brain, although I guess that becomes another issue. Sorry, I'm trying to keep my lights on here. But maybe it's better to say where in stages of processing or when. And so this is where we talk about early versus late filtering, right? So the phrase here is early selection. So down at the bottom, I've got a little bit of a diagram of Broadbent's concept of how attention works, right? So the idea is that we have sensory memory, right? All this information comes into our senses, is held in sensory memory for a very brief amount of time. And then as it's passed on to higher level stuff, and this higher level stuff would be things like working memory and decision making and other higher cognitive processes. The idea is that these higher cognitive processes really have limits on how much information they can handle. So what we want to do is we want to create a bottleneck. And the idea of a bottleneck is that we're going to restrict how much information can get that far into the cognitive systems. So that means we're going to start pulling things out and subtracting things out before that happens. And that's what early selection means here. So an early selection theory of attention suggests that background noise, distraction, things that are task irrelevant are going to get removed from the sense data coming in before it ever gets into higher cognitive processing, right? That's kind of what we're seeing with that bottleneck diagram at the very bottom. Now, this makes certain predictions. It makes the prediction then that in order for any information to be processed at higher levels, we're going to have to direct our attention at it. And that's the goal of attention here, is to determine what's allowed to make it through this filter, right? And so that's what attention does, is it sets parameters on the filter that says, if we're going to attend to it, it's going to pass through the filter, through the bottleneck, and make it into higher processing centers where we're going to be able to remember that information, be able to provide some responses about that information, make decisions based on that information. So we're going to see all of that processed information being able to influence any kind of response we ask people to make in a laboratory setting. And if it's never attended to, that means it never gets processed. And we would expect then that people will completely have no ability to make a response that's influenced by that filtered out information, right? That's what early selection means. Late selection, on the other hand, is a little different. Late selection would suggest that all of that information makes it into these more central processing centers. And that would mean then that attention only works to select the relevant from the irrelevant stuff after it's into our working memory and decision-making stages. And that would then suggest then that even some of the information that we have decided is irrelevant is still being processed to some degree, and therefore we might be able to remember some things about it, right? And that's called late selection. So this distinction is relevant because now it allows us to maybe design certain experiments where we can try to see, well, can people say anything or not say anything about the unattended information? And that's going to tell us whether early selection or late selection is possibly happening. I also have one little note here that the concept of early selection is consistent with feature searches. So I want to explain that real quick. We just got done talking about Ann Treisman's research on feature and conjunction searches in the end of the previous video. And one of the things to say about that is that feature searches suggest then that all of those background distractors that don't share any features with the target we're looking for just get filtered away very quickly, right? And so that filtering happens very, very early in the stages of visual processing. On the other hand, conjunction searches maybe require us to process more of those features and then use some sort of more central process to determine whether the target is present. But we don't need to keep on talking about the visual search research. Instead, we're going to shift over here to these kinds of studies that ask people whether they can possibly report any information about unattended information. And the idea here is that that's going to help us decide whether we're looking at early or late selection. Sorry, I didn't mean to click the screen there. I've got little messages popping up. So let's first talk about the dichotic listening task. As you can see, this is a very old 70-some years old study that was done. And so even though it's a very old study, the data are still quite relevant to helping shed light on the difference here between early and late selection. So dichotic listening means that we're going to maybe just put some headphones on, and we're going to have two different messages in each ear. Sounds kind of weird, right? So you're going to hear like a recording of someone speaking, like they're reading from a book in the left ear. And meanwhile, you're going to hear a different voice reading from a different book in your right ear. And your task is you're told, shadow the message maybe in your left ear, right? So what does that mean? That means that I have to block out the right ear. I just have to completely ignore the right ear. And I'm just going to listen to the voice in my left ear, and I'm going to repeat everything that person is saying word for word. So that's our task. And so now, after someone has performed this task, we're going to ask them if they can say anything at all about what the person in the right ear was talking about. All right, so the question is that was the unattended stream, but did they actually process any information? Did they actually have the ability to report what that person was talking about? And as it turns out, they cannot, right? So they pretty much have no idea what that person was talking about. So that kind of supports the idea of some early selection, right? That the information from what's happening in their right ear never makes it into working memory systems, and so it's never getting processed or stored or anything like that. And you're not able to say anything about it at all later. But curiously, there's a little bit of conflicting finding here, because what also happens is that sometimes what they will do is they will have that unattended stream switch, right? So maybe it switches from English to German kind of halfway through the task. And people will report that. So even though they don't notice the actual content of the message, they do report the change in language, right? So this might suggest then that there may be certain sounds that are more salient and more bottom-up driven that kind of drive your attention a little bit here. But try to keep my lights on. That motion sensor in the back drives me crazy. Anyway, so there's mostly early selection is being supported by this finding, but there's still a little exception to that. But also, there's another finding that's happening here, which is that if we do another version of this where the unattended stream is speech, or in another case, it might be some other kinds of sounds that are not speech sounds, people can report the difference, right? They say, yes, it was a human voice speaking, or it was some other kind of stuff, right? And then here's the really weird finding. So what's happening here is the unattended stream sometimes will switch ears, right? So you're told to follow the left ear and ignore the right ear. But what we might do is randomly, at some randomly determined time, we're going to switch them so that the message that you're following shifts over to the right ear. And what we might wonder here is, does this mean people are going to shift and follow the message from the left to the right, or are they going to just stay in the left ear and start shadowing the new stream that's coming into the left ear? And what happens is that people follow the message, not the ear, right? So again, if early filtering was happening, we would expect that one of the ways this could be manifest is just a strategy that focuses on ignoring everything that's happening in the right ear and only focusing on things happening in the left ear. But because people are following the message, this would suggest that attention might also be doing more processing here, and that the filtering is happening at the level of the content, not at the level of the stimulus being in the left ear, right? And so that important point means that I'm not necessarily filtering at the level of the ears, which is very early in the perceptual process, but I'm filtering based on higher level information about the meaning of the message, and that's what I'm tracking. So in a situation like this would suggest then that could possibly be late selection, what's happening here, right? So let's talk about that a little bit more. So according to the idea of late selection, filtering happens only after we've processed the information. So after we've processed and determined the meaning of the stimulus, then I'm going to then apply some sort of attentional filtering to suggest that, okay, now that I know the meaning, these things can be ignored because they're not relevant to my task, but these other things need to be tracked and followed and paid more attention to because that's relevant to the task. So that's what late selection is, as I've described it here. It's selection on the basis of meaning. And as I earlier had noted, this is a little more conjunction with or consistent with conjunction searches. But let's go back to Cherry's research again. So another component of the stuff that Cherry was doing is related to what's called the cocktail party effect. So what happens in the cocktail party effect is simply just a situation where if you're at a party, right? The idea is you're at a cocktail party, you're in a room full of people and everybody's talking. And you could just be doing your own thing, and maybe you're having a conversation with someone. But if someone on the other side of the room just calls out your name, not necessarily super loudly, but just says your name, we have a tendency to hear that, right? It's just like, oh, somebody called my name. And even when you're not attending to it. And that's kind of the point. So that's what Cherry wanted to investigate here. So we're going to do this dichotic listening task again. And we're going to have people shadowing one ear, like the left ear. But what they're also going to do is they're going to have the message in the unattended stream have the person's actual name embedded into it. And so then the question then becomes is that when it gets to that point in the message, will the person notice and hear their name being spoken? And they do. So that again would suggest some sort of late filtering, right? Because now the information's coming in, you're hearing the words, you're just not paying much attention to it after the meaning has been processed, unless it becomes something that really grabs you. In that case, that's hearing your name. Here's another way to look at this as well. So we can do EEG research here. So we don't necessarily want to dig into all of the details about EEG analysis here, but what happens is that there are certain flags that you can see in EEG research. By flag, I just mean you're looking at these waveforms, right, of the brainwave activity, and there are certain signals that emerge that tend to be directly linked to specific kinds of cognitive processes. And they all have these weird names like N400, right? So the N400 ERP is short for event-related potential. And so what's happening here is that there's an event happening either as a stimulus or something in the brain, and that causes a potential. And that potential means a bunch of neurons are firing action potentials. And this particular ERP is called N400. But what we know about N400 is that it tends to spike whenever a person is engaging in semantic processing. And what Luck and Hilliard found back in the 90s is that we can see the N400 spike in the EEG waveform even when as a result of unattended information. So let's just say, for example, that we can repeat something. This is not exactly what Luck and Hilliard did, but let's do the dichotic listening task again. But now on the left side, which is the attended stream, it could be music. The right side is semantic, it's language. And even though you're ignoring the unattended stream and you can't say anything about what the language is saying because you're following the music, we still see the N400, right? So that would suggest that there's still some semantic processing happening here. Another example of some late selection and shows some semantic processing of unattended information comes from these priming studies. So let's talk about these priming studies. So what we're going to do is we're going to present people words on a computer screen, one at a time. So first off, I have a list of words here labeled congruent: hand, palm, wrist. Of course, we know how that's congruent, right? Your hand, your palm, your wrist, three parts of your hand, right? So those three words together are a meaningful sequence of words. So you see the word hand on screen, it goes away, then the word palm appears, and then the word wrist appears. And what we're interested in here is having the person respond to the word wrist. And the point here is that why are you responding? What are you responding to? Just the appearance of the word wrist? Well, no, what we want people to do is we want people to determine if the stimulus is a word or a non-word, right? And so they're actually doing this for every word that they see. So in the case of hand, palm, wrist, they are all words. So they're going to press a button that says, yes, that's a word. In other cases, in other conditions, other trials, there might be some made up words presented here, in which case they would have to choose the other option, say, no, that's not a real word. But in these cases here, in the congruent list, they're all words. So we're going to measure their reaction time to hand, and then we're going to measure their reaction time to palm, and then we're going to measure their reaction time to saying yes to wrist. And as you might expect, their reaction time is pretty fast to wrist. Why is it fast? Well, this is called priming. The idea is that when I see the word wrist, I'm trying to recognize, is that a word? So this means that I need to start searching my memory of words to find a match, right? I got to look somewhere in my mental lexicon to say, is the word wrist in there somewhere, right? And that's how I know it's familiar, and therefore that's how I know it's a real word, and I can say yes. That's how recognition works, right? But the idea is that if I've already recently been shown the word hand and also recently been shown the word palm, then those activate concepts in my mental lexicon that are essentially adjacent to the word wrist. And that means what we might want to refer to here is called the spreading activation model. And what's going to happen with the spreading activation model is we are going to have this activation of hand and palm spread over to the nearby word in our mental lexicon, wrist. So the word wrist has already received a little bit of extra activation before it even shows up on screen. And so then when it finally does appear on the screen, it doesn't take much mental effort for me to activate that idea and recognize it and say yes, right? So the idea is that this is what priming is priming is actually making you more prepared to respond to that stimulus because in a way you're already kind of covertly thinking about it in advance. And you didn't even know you were thinking about the word wrist, but seeing the words hand and palm in sequence kind of make you do, right? That's what priming is all about. We also have an incongruent list where it's tree, palm, wrist. So curious here is that we have the word palm in the second position, but in this case, because it follows the word tree, it would be natural to assume then that the meaning of the word palm that gets activated here is not the palm of your hand, but it's probably a tree palm tree, right? So in that case, none of those things are semantically related to the word wrist, and you would expect no priming. And of course, that's exactly what happens, right? So reaction time to wrist in the congruent list is fast. Reaction time to wrist in the incongruent list is slow. That shows priming, but it doesn't necessarily show anything about late selection, not quite yet. Let's consider this other variation here. So what do? Visual backward masking of the second word. I've talked about masking in one of the earlier videos. Masking occurs when you show an image on screen, and then it flashes for a second, and then it's immediately followed by some sort of a random array of lines or something like this that makes it hard to report. And I do have a video here, so let's see if we can. So this is not a demonstration of, let me stop that for a second. This is not a demonstration of the semantic priming study that I'm just talking about, but it is a demonstration of priming itself. So this is the unmasked letter, and you're just going to see a letter flash on screen. Right? There it was. So if I were to ask you what was that, you should be able to say it's the letter A. But now we're going to have a masked letter. So an SOA stands for stimulus onset asynchrony. So the one here is a reference to a value of 1 is the fastest setting. So that means that we're going to present a letter, but then we're going to very, very quickly switch it to a mask stimulus. So that you saw the mask probably, right? Just a bunch of random lines all over the screen. You probably cannot say much about what the letter was, right? Very low probability that you could even report what that letter is. If we increase the SOA to value 2, it's a little easier to see. I saw the letter Z there, right? So the masking effect doesn't work quite so well there. Let's try it at SOA 4. And it's very easy to see the letter E there, also at SOA 8. And the letter N, in that case, becomes very easy to see. But when the SOA was set at a very short duration, SOA 1, I don't even know what that letter was. So this is how we can create this effect of saying, I've presented a stimulus to you, you saw it, but the question is, did you process it? Do you even know what that is? Now, of course, you can just ask people if they know what it is, but as we've noted here, they're going to say, no, I don't know what that letter was. But the importance of the priming method is that the priming method can give us some more subtle information about whether or not that was processed, even below the level of awareness, and therefore we could say it was not attended to at any conscious level, but it still might have been processed. And this would, of course, support a late selection model to suggest that information gets processed even when you're not paying attention to it. So I've already noted what happens here in our regular version, right? When the poem is not masked in our congruent list, we're going to have fast reaction time to wrist, showing the effect of priming. What happens in the congruent condition where we mask the word poem? This is not a critical variation, but it's worth asking, what happens when we mask poem in the congruent list? Reaction time is a little slower, right? Because the idea is that, well, you're still were exposed to the word hand, so that could have done some slight priming of the word poem. But it does suggest here that because it's faster than other control groups, that maybe there's still some sort of priming happening as a result of seeing the word palm, even though it was masked and you don't consciously remember it. So that would suggest maybe there's still priming, and therefore you did process it, but the effect is not super strong. So that's our conclusion here, right? That priming has occurred regardless of the masking. So that suggests that there were some unconscious processing of the masked word, which is part of what late selection says here. But maybe more critical is what happens with the incongruent list. So as already described, when palm is not masked, we're going to have slow reaction time to the word wrist because it's not semantically related to tree palm, right? So now what happens when we mask the word palm in the incongruent list? This is where things get a little weird. Why? What happens here? When we mask the word palm, so it's going to be tree, palm, wrist. It's the incongruent list, but we're masking the second word. Our reaction time suddenly becomes fast. So this is almost something that's like, how do we even explain this, right? It just seems like it's unexplainable. What in the world? How could we explain that? Well, what we think is happening here is that because we have unconsciously processed the word palm, right? So the suggesting here is that the palm is still being processed. We're not paying attention to it. We don't have any conscious report, but it still made it in to some kind of cognitive processing system. And then what happens is that the meaning of the word palm is there's two meanings, right? It can be the palm of your hand, but it can also mean the palm of a palm tree, right? So which meaning do we usually interpret when we see it? Well, of course, it requires context. If I just see the word palm in isolation, I don't know necessarily which one it is. But if I see the word palm next to the word hand, then obviously I'm going to think it has to do with that kind of palm. If I see the word palm next to the word tree, then I think of palm trees. But in this case, because I see the word tree, but then the word palm is processed at an unconscious level, what's happening here is that all possible meanings of the word palm become activated unconsciously. So that means the palm tree concept has been activated, but so has the palm of your hand concept been activated. So then when you see the word wrist, we're going to see that spreading activation effect happening again, and we get the priming effect, and we get fast reaction times to wrist here. That would suggest then that what happens is that the word gets processed at the unconscious level, and the role of attention is not to just process the word, but it's to determine the meaning of the word, right? And so when I process it more consciously, conscious attention works to select the correct meaning. And so when the correct meaning is semantically relevant, we get priming. When it's not semantically relevant, we don't get priming. But when it's masked, we get both meanings activated, and therefore conscious attention is not going to be there to help select the appropriate meaning. So instead, we get all possible meanings, and that gives us a little bit of priming again. So that's a convoluted explanation, and I apologize that it is convoluted, but that's the way it is. But this supports, again, the idea of late selection, that unattended information still makes it in, it still gets processed, but it doesn't get completely processed, right? But it still can have subtle influences on our reactions to other stimuli. Right? So that's what this is all about here. Now, so we've provided mostly data supporting late selection models, although, of course, there's still evidence of early selection models, and it might be possible to think that maybe filtering happens in both, right? Why does it have to be one or the other? Can't we have both early selection and late selection happening? And the answer is, yeah, of course, why not? There's a tendency sometimes in psychology to kind of see these kinds of dichotomies, and we want to fight over that, right? And somebody's going to get into the early selection camp, and somebody else is going to get into the late selection camp, and they're going to argue. And yeah, that's happened quite a bit over the last 3 or 4 decades. But, the answer likely always turns out to be it's a little bit of both. So, what do we want here? Let's talk about the answer might depend on task load. I think I might have mentioned in talking about driving earlier in the notes that we usually think of the radio as not being particularly distracting, but it might sometimes be distracting, right? If you're in a very demanding driving context, let's say you're driving in a part of town or in a town you've never been in or a part of town you don't go to much, and you're looking for some place, right? A store, a street that you got to make a turn on, and you're not sure where it is. And the traffic's really busy, so you have to simultaneously watch out for what's going on with all the other cars and drive carefully, but you also got to watch for, the roads that you're looking for or the store sign that you're looking for. It becomes very, very perceptually demanding as well as just cognitively demanding. One of the things we might have a tendency to do is turn the radio off, right? If I'm driving around and everything is just cool and easy to do, I might be blasting the stereo in the car, but as soon as things get more difficult, I'm just like, turn that off, right? Because I don't want to be distracted by that. So it can possibly distract us, right? Even though I could potentially block it out, right? I could do late selection and just let that stuff come in, and then I would choose to block it out. I don't even want to do that, right? I want to reduce my cognitive load. So I'm going to do what we might consider here some external filtering in a way, right? So external filtering is just I'm going to eliminate a stimulus here rather than even filtering it at a more early level of attentional processing. We'll call this really early filtering, right? I have just cut it out before it ever gets to my ears. So the idea here is that, okay, early filtering might be more relevant in these kinds of situations where the task demand is really, really high. The task load is difficulty, because what happens here is that I really want to minimize the processing of unnecessary information. So let's ramp up some of the early filtering that's happening. Here's an example of that with this perceptual load business here. So what happens is that we have a task that is perceptually difficult or perceptually easy. And what has to happen is when the task load gets more difficult, maybe what happens is I want to do some early filtering. So what's our task? Let's look at the low load condition on the right-hand side, the little image. You see like a little circular array of zeros, and there's an X at the top, and there's an N to the side. So your task is to keep your eyes centered in this screen. You're going to see all these letters appear, And your task is to judge whether there's an X present in this little circle of letters. Now, in the case where all of the distractors are O's and the target is an X, that's a very easy task. It has very low perceptual load. So, of course, you're going to be pretty quick at saying, yes, there's an X. But a second question we're going to ask is, can you tell me what letter was off to the side? So sometimes it's a letter N, like we see here, it might be something else, right? And so you say, okay, you said yes to the X, but what was the letter to the side? And people are going to say, yeah, that's an N. I saw the N, right? But in the high load condition, we see here that the task becomes perceptually more difficult. It is harder to visually discriminate the letter X from all of these other distractors, right? Whereas the O's, it's really obvious. It's kind of like a feature search, but now it's more of a conjunction search, right? It's harder. And so now I can still perform the task, though I'm probably a little slow to respond to the presence of the X. But if I ask someone to report what was that letter off to the side, now they're going to say, no idea. I really don't know. So what we're seeing here is that under low perceptual load, unattended information makes it in. That would be late selection. But under higher perceptual load, the unattended information is not getting in, right? And so that would be early selection. So that's one example that shows that it can be both. Another way is to think about how demanding the task is at the level of working memory. Now, we haven't yet had a chance to talk much about memory systems and working memory, so maybe we don't want to expand on this too overly much, but the idea here is that we should already know, well, one basic idea of 7 plus or minus 2. We're going to talk about some of the concerns over that exact number, but nevertheless, the idea is that it suggests that working memory has a limited capacity for how much information it can handle. And what's happening here is that when the task already has a high working memory demand, that is, whatever task relevant information we need to gather here is going to use up most of our working memory, that would suggest that we're letting in a lot of information and maybe we're processing all of it. And we want to try to prioritize, right? We want to try to prioritize which things are relevant and which things are not relevant. And I have to think about them in order to do this. But as the task gets more and more demanding at this memory level, my working memory system just gets overloaded, and whatever ability it has to prioritize what's important and what's not important to the task maybe starts to break down a little bit, right? So in this case, the breakdown is happening more internally, right? So that would be more late selection stuff. In order to maybe understand how we could see filtering and selection happening both early and late, here Wickens' model helps us kind of visualize this a little bit. Wickens does two things here. He gives us first a theory of information processing, and that's this little flow chart that you're looking at here. So we get the stimulus coming in, it goes through our sensory memory, and then we perceive it. And then that information from perception goes to working memory down below, or it can go to a decision-making module in the brain. And then we decide on a response and execute the response. And then, of course, by executing a response, that changes the stimulus. So that loops back and feeds back into the sensory inputs as well. And of course, working memory influences perception and long-term memory, but it also can influence our decision-making as well. So all of that information is kind of interconnected between working memory, long-term memory, perception, and decision-making. That's a theory of information processing, right? How do we make decisions and store information and do all this stuff? But importantly, what Wickens adds to this is this little fuel tank sitting above labeled attention resources. So the suggestion here is that there are some of these stages of cognition here that maybe demand resources, and resources sort of work as a fuel, and it provides the energy needed to perform these processes. So we just talked about how perception might use resources, right? Because we can have tasks that are high in their perceptual load, and there are tasks that are low in their perceptual load. And load here can be operationalized as how many resources does it need, and does it really start to deplete this tank full of resources? So we can literally think of it as something like a gas tank, and it can only hold so much. And once we start to use them, we're going to run out of gas, right? That's what we're kind of seeing over here on the right, is that once any one of these subsystems it becomes very demanding of attention resources, then the resource demand is high, and that's going to deplete our available resources. So this would suggest that when perceptual load is high, perhaps, it's going to deplete resources, and we're going to have less resources left over for higher level processes like working memory and decision making. So that's when it would be useful, for example, to do more early selection to make it a little easier for those working memory systems to function. On the other hand, when perceptual load is low, we can let more stuff in, but then, of course, we always run the risk of overloading the working memory and decision-making boxes because now those are going to start demanding resources as well. But the idea, of course, is those depletions or those limitations on performance by depleting resources can occur all throughout these many different stages, even through the active response execution. If I have to do something physically that's much more difficult, then that's where the attentional resources might end up being depleted, is at that level as well. Here's another example that is used to illustrate some early and late selection, and maybe we can think about resources a little bit here. So this is called change blindness. And so it goes back here to the late 90s, called the flicker paradigm. And what's going to happen, and I'll just go ahead and start the video and talk over it here, is you're going to see two images switching back and forth in rapid succession, and if you can spot the difference between them. So task is you have to keep your eyes fixed at the center. It doesn't even necessarily matter if you don't just keep your eyes fixed. You can scan a little bit and move your eyes around. And you just saw that. So it's called the flicker paradigm because you're seeing these images flicker back and forth, but something is changing the entire time. And what happens is that most people never ever see or notice what's changing. And in this case, you're going to see, they already told you where to look. Look at the pants of the guy on the left, and we see them changing from blue jeans to more tan color. And now, of course, because you know where to look, it's very obvious. So, of course, the question is, why isn't it obvious anyway? This is all suggestive of early filtering, right? A lot of those details are just not making it in. You're not processing. You're not paying attention to it. So you're not. It's been selected out early. It's been filtered out early. In this next example here, it's the reflection on the car window to the right-hand side of the screen. And so now you know where to look. It's very obvious. I'll just go ahead and pause it there. All right, so flicker paradigm is more supportive of early selection, but what if we change the setup a little bit here? One study that was done was they did a flicker paradigm change blindness experiment with a bunch of different photographs that were all driving related scenes, right? Like cars on the road, stuff like that. And so this one's almost a driving related scene, but it's also got a bunch of people and buildings and stuff too. So that's it. But what we're going to do here is we're going to use as our participants people who spend a lot of time driving, but also people who spend a lot of time looking at other cars while they're driving. What are we talking about? We're talking about police officers. So we're going to bring in a sample of police officers who spend a long time as part of their day, maybe just watching other cars, looking for traffic violations, speeding, and stuff like that. Meanwhile, we're going to have as another group a bunch of just regular people who, of course, drive, but they don't have that kind of expertise in watching other cars. And what we find is that in this kind of flicker change blindness paradigm, the police officers are much more likely to notice the change than our regular control group here. Right, so the regular control group just looks like everybody else in the change blindness research. They fail to notice this stuff. But something about the expertise and top-down knowledge-driven process of the police officers allows them to notice these changes, as if maybe they are more effective at bringing more information in, and they're doing late selection, not early selection. So now the level of expertise you have influences where the attentional filter occurs, right? And so suggesting here that you can process more perceptual information, and that gives you more information, making it into your working memory, where you can then start using that information for making important decisions, perhaps, which would be relevant for somebody is an expert in watching other cars and needs to observe other cars here. Trying to go to the next slide here. All right, wrapping this up. We have one more research paradigm to talk about here, the vigilance task. So we've talked a bit about sustained attention already. The idea is that over time, if I'm trying to maintain selective attention on a task for long periods of time, that's what we mean by sustained, or maintaining a vigilance, right? We see what's called a vigilance decrement, right? Your ability to detect the target stimulus decreases, so you have fewer hits and more misses. And when you do detect it, your reaction time is going to be a little bit slower. So this research here coming from Temple and others back in 2000. Of course, this methodology has been done many times in the 26 years since then. So we got the performance decrement, right? What also happens is that people will report being fatigued, right? That this is what we might call mental fatigue, right? It's not physically demanding, it's not physically fatiguing, but it becomes mentally fatiguing. And we can ask questions like, does this kind of effect reflect some sort of depletion of these attentional resources, right? And so we could think that that's how we can explain the vigilance decrement is the resources start to disappear. We also know, though, that people report feeling stressed. We can ask them just to simply provide a verbal report about their feelings, or little surveys and scales that can be quickly administered where the people can answer certain questions about feelings related to stress. But we can also do things like EKG, and EKG can tell us things about heart rate and heart rate variability that provides some information about the underlying sympathetic nervous system's response. And so when we see the sympathetic nervous system becoming more active, we're going to end up with a stress response, right? We see evidence of all of this happening here. Something else that could also be happening here. So, well, let me mention one more thing about the stress. Stress and cognition have a complex relationship with each other. Usually we just think of stress as something that causes negative emotional feelings, but it can also impact our cognition, right? It impacts our working memory and it decreases our working memory capacity. And it can impact our attentional filtering capacities as well. So altogether, we are maybe just a little bit less effective at managing incoming information and so forth because of stress. Another thing that can happen here, you might have heard of the default mode network before. So what's happening is that when you're engaged in a task, you have some relevant task positive network that controls processing the information that's relevant and performing the responses that are relevant. But we also have something else in the brain for when we're not engaged in any particular task called the default mode network. And that is usually associated with things like mind wandering and other reflexive self-referential thinking, thinking, things about what you're worried about, feelings of worry, and even just random memories about things and so forth. So what we see is that sometimes when we get bored, the default mode network takes over. And we can sometimes think of the default mode network as a network that doesn't really require the same amount of attentional resources as the task positive network does. So what happens is that as the attentional resources get depleted, the task positive network can't really function anymore. So then we shift over into the default mode. And while the default mode is doing its thing, the attentional resources can gradually recover and be restored. And then once they come back to some level, I can then shift back into my task positive network, which allows me to return back to the task. But I'm going to have these attentional lapses, right? As the resources drop, I shift into the default mode and I have to wait for things to come back. And then I get back to the task. But these lapses are going to occur now and then. That's going to cause me to have some performance mistakes on the task, right? So that's a kind of a nice little story to tell about how vigilance in the decrement and mistakes happen over time. One final thing to say about all of this is that there are some complaints about what these attention resources are, right? It's a good idea to say, yeah, we got this, the brain needs energy. But no one has a concrete operational definition of exactly what resources are and where they are stored in the brain and what happens to them when they are depleted, and then how are they replenished or restored. We know about there's a lot of research done into looking about effective ways of restoring resources. That is, when you're doing something that generates a lot of difficult mental work, you can take a break, right? And what's a good way to take a break? What should you do during your break that's going to effectively restore these resources? And there's a ton of studies. Sometimes it's just sitting quietly. Um, we actually did some research in our lab here looking at playing video games, but in particular casual video games that are not really demanding, very different from something like an action video game that's actually very attentionally demanding. It's probably going to be counterproductive to restoration, right? A lot of studies also on nature exposure, just being in a green space can restore these. But separate from these questions about what makes an effective break, some other work we've been doing has been looking at an alternative to resource theory here, where we can simply just appeal to thermodynamics. What are we talking about here? Well, all this information processing in the brain, of course, requires neurons to be doing things, right? They're going to fire action potentials. And then the sodium potassium pump has to get involved in returning the neurons back to their resting state. And this is very metabolically demanding. It uses oxygen and glucose, primarily glucose. And so this is a form of information, or sorry, of energy use, right? We are converting glucose into ATP, right, for the cells, and so this is a very energetic process. And the first law of thermodynamics tells us that this use of energy and this conversion of energy here is going to do something, right? It's going to generate work, of course, and that work is the mental work that we are uh, generating. But there's going to be a byproduct of that work, right? And that's heat. And so we see then that the energy use in the brain is going to generate heat. This would suggest that if we were able to measure temperature fluctuations within the brain, specifically in those task positive network regions of the brain, we would expect there to be rising heat levels in those areas of the brain that are more active. This is a little challenging to do, but there's some preliminary evidence to suggest that this really does happen. And then this would also suggest then that during the restoration period, what's happening is that those areas are cooling down. And once they cool down again, they're maybe more effective at using the energy again. So here we're just talking about maybe the brain overheating simply, right? So just like an engine in your car, if it overheats, it's not going to work very well, right? And you want to cool it down before you use it again. Same can happen here. Well, the brain actually already has a cooling system, just like your car has a cooling system, right? And it kind of works in a similar way as a radiator. Technically, it's a heat sink here. Blood flow primarily is the key mechanism here, right? So arterial blood provides all of the glucose and energy to the brain, but then after that blood has been used, all the glucose has been used and oxygen has been consumed. We have this deoxygenated blood. It gets to the veins, and then it's warm, right? It's perhaps even gotten warmer as it's passing through these regions of the brain. And so now that warm blood passes out of the head back into the body where it can return and cool down a little bit, right? And so then cooler blood goes back to the brain, warm blood comes back down the neck. So that's a heat exchange kind of mechanism here as well. Cerebrospinal fluid, CSF, that's a slower process, but still there's going to be some degree of CSF outflow draining into the veins and draining into the lymph. So that way we can also dissipate some of that heat. The head might get hot, so we might sweat. And so again, that provides some cooling as well. And also, interestingly, some research has suggested that yawning is a thermoregulatory mechanism. So when you yawn and you get a great big inhale, you're moving cool air through the throat. So the idea is that maybe what's happening is you're cooling the blood in the neck, right, through that. And that's going to help cool everything down, right? So again, the idea is that why do we yawn? We yawn when we're sleepy, but sometimes we might yawn when we're bored, right? And so the suggestion here is that boredom, because the task positive network has overheated and we've switched into the default mode, we're going to yawn at that point because we're just doing things to try to help cool down, relevant regions of the brain. And then once that cools down, we can shift back to the task mode. So recovery now is all just about heat exchange, right? Getting that heat out of the brain and cooling things down a little bit here. And overload means increased brain temperature and impaired functioning, fatiguing and suppression of the task positive network, failure to suppress the default mode network. Because that's something that happens as well, is that when the task positive network is active, it's going to suppress the default mode. And then once that suppression fails, the default mode network kind of intrudes onto the task. This theory can also explain boredom as well, right? So two things are happening when we get mentally fatigued. Sometimes we just get overloaded because of too much, right? And we're overusing the task positive network. But sometimes we can be understimulated as well. And that's when we're bored. We don't have anything around to help stimulate the task positive network. And so what happens is that there's still energy going to the brain, and there's no task positive network to use it, but we still need to use it, right? That's also part of thermodynamics, is that you can't just build up all of this energy, right? You're going to have to use it for something. Second law says that entropy must always increase, but entropy comes from actually expending energy and generating heat. And so we have to do something with that energy. And so that means that when we are bored and we're going to have this buildup of energy, then the default mode network just becomes really, really active. And I become really, really active with daydreaming and all this other kind of stuff. By the way, you might notice that this kind of sounds Freudian, and this is a weird kind of side note here, but certainly the idea of having an excess buildup of mental energy and the pleasure principle, I don't want to make that connection very, very obvious or direct, right? I don't want to suggest that this idea is Freudian, but there's kind of an alignment there, just a little hint of it anyway. All right. Well, that is the end of this particular chapter. So we're wrapped up here, and we'll have new videos coming for the next chapter soon enough.